Something is deeply wrong with the most famous story ever told, and the problem has been hiding in plain sight for 2,000 years. The people who wrote the prophecies didn't recognize the one who fulfilled them. The nation that produced the very scrolls describing a coming Messiah looked that Messiah in the face and turned away. Not because they were ignorant, not because they were wicked, but because of something far more complicated, far more human, and far more heartbreaking than anyone has ever told you. Today, we are going to investigate that contradiction, not as an attack, not as a debate, but as a forensic examination, a cold, honest, methodical look at one of the greatest unsolved tensions in all of human history. By the time this investigation is over, you will understand something that most Christians and most Jews have never been taught, and it will change the way you read the Bible forever. Let's start at the beginning, not the theological beginning, the human one. The year is 30 AD. You are standing inside the walls of Jerusalem. Close your eyes for a moment and try to feel what that means. The smell of dust and animal blood from the temple courts drifts through the narrow streets. Roman soldiers in iron armor patrol the gates, their sandals scraping against stone that was already ancient before their empire was born. The temperature is dry and relentless. The tension is worse. Taxes have been crushing the population for decades. Not just Roman taxes, Herod's taxes, temple taxes, multiple layers of financial extraction that leave most families with barely enough to survive. Farmers who cannot pay lose their land. Men who cannot pay their debts end up working as day laborers, or worse. And over everything, over every transaction and every conversation and every prayer spoken in the morning, hangs the shadow of the eagle, the Roman eagle, carved above the entrance to the temple, a daily reminder of who actually owns this land, this city, this people. Crucifixions happen on the roads outside Jerusalem regularly enough that people have learned to look away. That is not a metaphor. Men, Jewish men, are nailed to crosses along the highway and left to die slowly while travelers pass beneath them. The Romans use crucifixion strategically as a tool of psychological terror. It is designed to break resistance by making resistance look like this: a man hanging in the sun, stripped of dignity, slowly asphyxiating in front of his family. This is the world in which Judaism is clinging to its identity by a thread. And into this world, this furnace of suffering, come the prophecies. Not as new texts. The prophecies are ancient. They have been memorized by schoolboys for centuries, copied by scribes with obsessive care, recited in synagogues across every city in Judea and beyond. And they say something magnificent. They say something that makes the suffering endurable. They say that one is coming, one from the line of David, one anointed by God. A Mashiach, a Messiah, an anointed king, who will break the yoke of the oppressor, rebuild the temple in glory, gather the scattered tribes of Israel from every corner of the earth, and usher in an age of peace so complete that the wolf will lie down with the lamb. Do you understand what those words mean to someone who has watched his brother crucified on a Roman road? They mean everything. This is where our investigation must begin, because you cannot understand why the Jewish people rejected Jesus unless you first understand what they were waiting for and what it would have cost them, emotionally and spiritually and politically, to accept someone different. We are not here to judge, we are here to understand. And understanding begins with a question. What if they were not wrong to expect something different? What if the prophecies themselves, the very texts that Christians cite as proof, actually describe two different figures, two messiahs, not one? Hold that question. We will return to it, because when we do, everything will shift. But first, you need to meet the man standing in Caiaphas's courtyard on the night of a very specific arrest. He is a rabbi. He is somewhere between 45 and 60 years old. He has spent his entire life, from childhood from the moment his father first placed a Torah scroll in his hands, studying these texts. He knows the book of Isaiah the way you know the street where you grew up. He knows every word of Daniel, every verse of Zechariah, every prophecy in Ezekiel, with the precision of a man who has recited them 10,000 times. He is not a fool. He is not a villain. He is one of the most educated, most devout, most scripture-saturated human beings alive in the first century. And he cannot accept Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah. Why not? Let's go inside his mind, carefully, with respect, because this is where the real story lives. The rabbi's name doesn't matter. What matters is his logic, and his logic is impeccable, given his framework. He opens the scroll of Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. He reads, "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey." He has read that verse thousands of times. He has heard people say that Jesus entered Jerusalem on a donkey and that this was the fulfillment of that prophecy. Fine. He grants that. But then he keeps reading. Verse 10. "I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. His rule will extend from sea to sea." The rabbi looks up from the scroll. He looks out the window at the Roman soldiers patrolling his city. His rule will extend from sea to sea. But Rome still rules from sea to sea. Has anything changed? The chariots are not gone. The war horses are not gone. The battle bow has not been broken. Caesar still sits on his throne in Rome. The rabbi moves to a different scroll. Amos chapter 9, verse 11. "In that day I will restore David's fallen shelter. I will repair its broken walls and restore its ruins, and will rebuild it as it used to be." He knows what David's shelter means. It means the temple. It means the throne. It means the full, sovereign, independent kingdom of Israel restored to its ancient glory. He walks outside and looks at the temple. Beautiful, yes, rebuilt by Herod in white marble that catches the sunlight like fire. But the temple is not sovereign. It is a permitted religious institution inside a Roman province. The high priest himself was appointed at various times by Roman authorities. The Torah is tolerated, not sovereign. Nothing has been rebuilt as it used to be. He goes back to his study and unrolls the scroll of Ezekiel chapter 37, verse 21. "I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land." Every Jew knows what the diaspora means. After the destruction of the first temple by Babylon in 586 BC, thousands of Jews were scattered. After subsequent persecutions, millions more now live in Egypt, in Babylon, in Rome itself, in Persia. The scattered tribes of Israel have not been gathered. They are still scattered. Nothing has been gathered. And now the rabbi opens the scroll that burns hottest in his heart. It is not a minor text. It is the beating center of Jewish messianic hope. He finds the passage in Isaiah chapter 11. "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore." Swords into plowshares. He looks at the soldiers. He looks at the crosses on the road. He looks at the taxes and the hunger and the despair. And he asks the only question a rational, scripture-literate man could ask: where is the peace? Where are the plowshares? Where is the nation that has laid down its sword because the Messiah came and transformed the world? Because if the Messiah came and nothing changed, if Rome still rules, if the temple is not sovereign, if the tribes are not gathered, if there is no universal peace, Then the Messiah did not come. This is not stubbornness. This is consistency. The rabbi has 4 specific objections, 4 criteria that a genuine Messiah, according to the accumulated weight of prophetic scripture, must fulfill. Let us state them plainly, as any first-century Jewish scholar would have stated them, because these 4 criteria will become the central exhibit in our forensic investigation. First, the Messiah must descend from David through a patrilineal line. The genealogy must be traceable, documentable, legally verifiable. The Messiah is a king, and Jewish kingship passes through the Father. This objection cuts straight to the heart of the Christian claim. The Gospel of Matthew opens with a genealogy tracing Joseph's lineage from Abraham through David to Jesus. The Gospel of Luke provides a parallel genealogy. But here is the problem that any first-century rabbi would immediately seize. If Jesus was born of a virgin, if Joseph was not his biological father, then Joseph's Davidic lineage does not legally transfer to Jesus. You cannot have it both ways. Either the virgin birth is true, in which case the Davidic genealogy is severed, or the Davidic genealogy is intact, in which case the virgin birth is irrelevant to the Messianic claim. The rabbi places his finger on this tension and does not move it. Christian theology responds with a nuanced argument that legal adoption in the ancient world and Joseph's acceptance of Jesus as his son constituted a valid transfer of lineage rights under Roman and Jewish legal customs. Some scholars also point to Luke's genealogy as potentially representing Mary's own Davidic descent, making the biological connection traceable through her. These are serious arguments. But to the rabbi in the first century, they required a degree of interpretive flexibility that felt, given the urgency of the moment, like special pleading. Second, the Messiah must rebuild the temple, not renovate it, not spiritualize it, but physically rebuild it in its complete sovereign glory. Jesus did not rebuild the temple. He did say, according to the Gospel of John, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." But John himself clarifies that Jesus was speaking about his own body, not the building. The Gospel writers record that this statement was used against Jesus at his trial, with witnesses accusing him of threatening to tear down the literal temple. Whether or not that accusation was accurate, the physical temple was never rebuilt by Jesus. In fact, Jesus predicted its destruction, predicting that not one stone would be left upon another, a prediction that came precisely true in 70 AD, when Titus's legions systematically demolished every structure on the Temple Mount. The rabbi hears that Jesus spiritualized the temple. He hears that the body is the new temple, and he thinks, that is a beautiful metaphor, but we are living under Roman occupation. My people need a real building. They need a real throne. A metaphor does not stop a legion. Third, the Messiah must gather all the dispersed Jews from every nation back to the land of Israel. In the year 30 AD, the Jewish diaspora stretches from the shores of the Caspian Sea to the Atlantic coast of Spain. There are large Jewish communities in Alexandria, in Babylon, in Rome itself. Communities that have been in exile for generations, that have built entire economies and cultural lives in their host nations, but that every year at Passover say together, "Next year in Jerusalem." Nadersimd. The prophets described a great ingathering, a physical, geographic restoration of the 12 tribes to their ancestral land. Nothing remotely resembling this has occurred during the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. Christian theology will later argue that the ingathering is a future event connected to the second coming. The rabbi replies that this is precisely the problem. You are asking me to accept a Messiah who defers all the most important criteria to a future appearance for which there is no guaranteed timeline. The obligation of prophecy is to be fulfilled, not indefinitely postponed. Fourth, the Messiah must bring universal peace, a transformation so complete that war itself becomes obsolete among the nations. In the year 30 AD, the Roman Empire is simultaneously conducting military operations in Britain, in Germany, in Persia, in North Africa. Thousands of men are dying in those campaigns. The Pax Romana, the famous Roman peace, is not universal peace. It is enforced submission at the point of a sword. And inside Judea itself, the tension between the Jewish population and Roman authority is ratcheting toward the catastrophe that will explode in 66 AD, when the Great Jewish Revolt begins and ends 4 years later, with the temple in ashes and 1 million Jewish dead. Universal peace has not arrived. It is not arriving. It is, from where the rabbi stands, moving in the opposite direction. These are not arbitrary criteria. They come directly from the texts, from Isaiah, from Ezekiel, from Amos, from Zechariah. They represent centuries of careful textual analysis by the greatest minds in Judaism. And the rabbi in Caiaphas's courtyard is watching a man from Galilee who healed people in obscure villages, who rode into Jerusalem on a borrowed donkey, who has now been arrested in a garden. And this man has fulfilled none of the 4 criteria. Rome is still here. The temple is still Herod's marble building inside a Roman province. Jews are still scattered across the known world. There is no peace. The rabbi's conclusion is not malice, it is exegesis. But here is where our investigation takes its first dramatic turn, because the rabbi is only half right, and the half he is missing will cost him everything. Before we examine the evidence he overlooked, we need to sit with a different character, one who is not operating from theology at all, one who is operating from survival. His name is Caiaphas. Joseph Caiaphas is the high priest of Israel in the year 30 AD. He has held this position for nearly 20 years, an extraordinary tenure in a role that Roman governors frequently assigned and revoked as political currency. The fact that Caiaphas lasted so long tells you everything you need to know about him. He is not primarily a theologian. He is a political operator of the highest order. Here is what keeps Caiaphas awake at night. The population of Jerusalem during Passover swells from approximately 50,000 to somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 pilgrims. That is a powder keg. The Romans know it is a powder keg. They bring in extra troops during Passover specifically because previous festivals have ended in riots, in massacres, in thousands of Jewish men dead in the streets. There have been Messianic claimants before Jesus. A man named Judas of Galilee led an uprising in 6 AD and was killed, along with his followers. A man named Theudas would later gather thousands at the Jordan River and be executed by Roman cavalry. Every time a messianic figure gathered a following, Rome came down with total and lethal force. Caiaphas has made his calculation. He has, in fact, stated it out loud, and the Gospel of John preserves his exact words. It is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. This is not a statement of theology, it is a statement of political arithmetic. Caiaphas is the CEO of an institution that survives only through careful management of Rome's patience. Jesus of Nazareth has just entered Jerusalem to enormous crowds shouting the ancient royal greeting, Hosanna to the Son of David. In the context of Passover, in the context of Roman paranoia about Jewish uprisings, this is an existential threat to every arrangement that is keeping the Jewish establishment alive. Caiaphas does not need to believe that Jesus is a blasphemer in order to want him removed. He needs to believe that Jesus is a problem, and Jesus is undeniably a problem. So you have two forces driving the rejection, and they are not the same force. The rabbi in the study is operating from sincere theological conviction. Caiaphas at the trial is operating from cold political calculation. and both of them are arriving at the same outcome through completely different roads. This matters. It matters because the story is not simple. It was never simple. It is not a story of evil men destroying a good man. It is a story of human institutions, human expectations, and human fears colliding with something that did not fit any existing category. And now, we come to the evidence that changes everything. The year is 1947. We are not in Jerusalem. We are 11 miles to the east, in the desert near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. A young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ed-Dib is climbing among the cliffs of Qumran, looking for a lost goat. He throws a stone into one of the caves. Instead of the sound of the stone hitting rock, he hears something else, the dull crack of clay shattering. He has just found the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Over the following years, archaeologists will excavate 11 caves in the Qumran area and recover thousands of fragments, the remains of approximately 900 manuscripts. Among them is something that makes scholars stop breathing. It is the great Isaiah scroll, an almost complete copy of the book of Isaiah, written on 17 sheets of leather stitched together into a scroll 11 meters long. Carbon-14 dating will later confirm what the paleographic analysis already suggested. This scroll was copied between 335 and 107 BC. That is not AD. That is before Christ. Before Christ was born, before Roman soldiers occupied Jerusalem, before any of the events we are discussing happened, this version of Isaiah was already sitting in a clay jar in a cave in the Judean desert. Why does this matter? Because for centuries, skeptics had argued that the book of Isaiah, particularly its later chapters, which contain the most striking messianic prophecies, had been edited or interpolated by later Christian scribes to make the text seem predictive. The Dead Sea Scrolls end that argument permanently. The text of Isaiah discovered at Qumran is nearly identical to the text used in modern Bibles. Nothing was changed. Nothing was added. The prophecies were always there. Which means that when we open Isaiah chapter 53, we are reading a document that was already ancient when Jesus was born. And what Isaiah 53 says is, let me be very direct with you, the most shocking text in the entire Hebrew Bible. The passage begins like this: Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Stop. This is the Hebrew Bible. This is Isaiah, one of the most revered prophets in all of Jewish tradition, and he is describing a figure who is despised and rejected, a figure who attracts no one by his appearance, a figure who suffers. This is not the warrior king. This is not the conquering son of David. This is something the rabbi in the study had no category for, because the rabbi had been reading the messianic prophecies selectively, gravitating toward the triumphant ones, filtering out the suffering ones. Continue reading. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. He was pierced, by his wounds we are healed. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. In the ancient world, piercing was associated with very specific forms of execution, and an individual bearing the punishment for the transgressions of many, dying so that others could receive peace. This is not a description of a military campaign. This is a description of substitutionary suffering, of a death that accomplishes something beyond itself. But the passage does not end with death. Read further. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. After suffering, he will see the light of life. After death, something else, something that undoes the death. Now, and this is the critical question for our forensic investigation, how did the rabbis of the first century interpret Isaiah 53? Did they see it as messianic? Did they read it as a description of the coming anointed one? The answer is more complex than most people know. The oldest Jewish Targum, a rabbinic Aramaic translation and interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures, actually begins its paraphrase of Isaiah 53 with the words, "Behold, my servant the Messiah shall prosper." The earliest rabbinical interpreters assigned this passage to the Messiah. It was only in the medieval period when Christians were increasingly using Isaiah 53 as a proof text in disputations and forced debates with Jewish scholars, that the dominant Jewish interpretation shifted to interpreting the servant as a collective symbol for the nation of Israel rather than an individual. The Talmud itself contains references to this passage in a messianic context. Tractate Sanhedrin records a tradition that the Messiah is sitting at the gates of Rome, binding and unbinding his wounds, suffering, waiting. The image of a wounded, suffering Messiah was not alien to ancient Jewish imagination. It was there. It was in the tradition, but it was uncomfortable. And in a world of Roman crosses and mandatory Roman taxes and Roman soldiers at the gate, the comforting prophecy was not the one about suffering. The comforting prophecy was the one about the sword. This shift tells you something, not about bad faith, but about context. When your enemy is using a text as a weapon against you, you develop a different relationship with that text. We will come back to why that is. But for now, here is the question that the rabbi in the first century could not answer. If Isaiah 53 describes a Messiah who suffers and is rejected and dies and then lives again, how do you reconcile that with the conquering king of Zechariah 9 and the temple builder of Amos 9 and the peace bringer of Isaiah 11? The answer that was hiding in plain sight, preserved in Jewish tradition itself, is that these are two different figures, two different roles, two different comings. We have arrived at the doctrine of the two messiahs. This is not a Christian innovation. This is not a theological workaround invented to defend Jesus. This doctrine appears explicitly in ancient Jewish texts, in the Talmud, in Midrashic literature, in the writings of the Dead Sea Scroll community at Qumran, long before Christianity became a dominant force. The Qumran community, the group of Jewish scholars who stored those 1,100 manuscripts in those desert caves, expected two messiahs, one priestly and one royal, one who would suffer and one who would triumph. The two figures have names in Jewish tradition. The first is the Mashiach ben Joseph, the Messiah son of Joseph. The second is the Mashiach ben David, the Messiah son of David. The Mashiach ben Joseph is the suffering servant. He comes in humility. He is a figure of pain and rejection. According to the Talmudic texts, he dies. In some traditions, he is killed fighting the enemies of Israel. He does not bring the final age. He prepares the way for the one who does. The Midrash Pesikta Rabbati, one of the great homiletical collections of ancient Judaism, describes the Mashiach ben Joseph in language that is startling in its parallels to the New Testament. He is given the Spirit of God. He bears the sins of Israel. He suffers, and through his suffering comes a redemption that Ben David will then complete. The Mashiach ben David is the triumphant king. He comes in power. He gathers the dispersed. He rebuilds the temple. He brings universal peace. His rule extends from sea to sea. He sits on the throne of David in a Jerusalem that is finally completely sovereignly free. There is a question that this tradition leaves quietly unanswered, and it is a question that burns at the center of the entire disagreement between Judaism and Christianity. The question is, could one person fulfill both roles in two separate historical moments? Or must they be two separate individuals? Ancient Judaism never definitively answered this. The tradition preserved both figures, described their distinct functions, acknowledged the tension between the suffering servant of Isaiah and the conquering king of Zechariah, but left the resolution open. This openness was not a flaw in the tradition. It was intellectual honesty about a genuine ambiguity in the text. When you see these two figures laid out side by side, something becomes visible that changes the entire shape of the disagreement. The rabbi who rejected Jesus was not wrong to expect the Messiah ben David. He was right to expect him. But he may have been premature in concluding that the absence of ben David's work meant that ben Joseph had not come. Christian theology says Jesus fulfilled the role of the Mashiach, ben Joseph, in his first coming. The humility, the suffering, the rejection, the piercing, the death, the resurrection, and will return to fulfill the role of the Mashiach ben David. Jewish tradition preserves the framework of two messiahs, but applies it to two separate individuals across time. The same essential structure, two different readings. The first-century rabbi did not reject Jesus out of ignorance of the suffering servant. He rejected Jesus because the suffering servant, in the furnace of Roman occupation, seemed like a luxury. What the nation needed was ben David. Now, immediately, the urgency of the present moment, the crosses on the road, the taxes crushing the farmers, the Roman eagle above the temple gate, made it almost impossible to accept that God's answer to that urgency was, "Not yet. First this, then that." But now we come to Daniel. And Daniel does not leave the question open. The book of Daniel, chapter 9, contains one of the most remarkable mathematical structures in all of ancient literature. The text is known as the prophecy of the 70 weeks. In Hebrew, the Shivim Shavuim, the 77s. Here is the relevant portion. Know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Anointed One, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the Anointed One will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Let us work through this text carefully, the way a forensic analyst would work through a document, because the precision here is remarkable. The word used for Anointed One in the original Aramaic is the word Mashiach. This is not a metaphor. This is not a general term. The text says explicitly the Mashiach, the Messiah, will come after a specific period of time measured in sevens and then will be cut off, will be put to death. The starting point of the prophecy is the word that goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. History records multiple decrees related to Jerusalem's restoration. The one that matches most precisely is the decree of the Persian king Artaxerxes III, issued in 445 BC, recorded in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 2, which authorized the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. The prophecy says, 7 sevens plus 62 sevens until the Mashiach comes. That is 69 sevens total. Now, what is a 7 in prophetic computation? The Hebrew word Shavua means a unit of 7. In prophetic literature, the standard interpretive key, drawing on Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6, applies a day-for-year principle. 1 prophetic day equals 1 calendar year. A 7 is therefore 7 years. 69 sevens is 483 years, but not 483 solar years. 483 prophetic years of 360 days each, the calendar standard used throughout the ancient Near East. 483 years of 360 days equals 173,180 days. At 173,180 days to the date of Artaxerxes' decree in 445 BC, adjusting for the lack of a year zero and the Julian to Gregorian calendar conversion, and you arrive at a date in the spring of 32 AD. Some calculations give 30 AD, some 33 AD, depending on which synchronization of the Artaxerxes calendar you accept. But every serious calculation lands in the same narrow window, the years when Jesus of Nazareth entered Jerusalem. Consider what it means that this calculation works. It means that a man sitting in Babylon in approximately 550 BC, writing with reed pen on parchment, was encoding a timeline that would resolve itself if the calculation is correct, in a specific 3-year window more than 5 centuries later, and that window corresponds within the margin of ancient calendar reckoning to the years of Jesus' final entry into Jerusalem. The prophecy then says, after those 69 sevens, the Mashiach will be cut off, killed. The Hebrew word used is karath. It means to be cut off, to be eliminated, to be removed by death. This is not metaphorical language. This is judicial or violent death. The Mashiach is cut off. And then comes the phrase that has haunted Jewish theological interpretation ever since, and will have nothing. Some translations render this as "but not for himself," meaning his death accomplishes something for others, not for his own benefit. The Aramaic carries the weight of a death that appears to produce nothing, no throne, no kingdom, no immediate triumph, but that the surrounding context suggests is part of a larger plan. The text then says, "The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary." The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, 40 years after the period specified in the prophecy, by the armies of Rome under the general Titus. The Roman historian Josephus, who was an eyewitness to the destruction, describes the scene in language that reads like the fulfillment of every prophetic warning in the Hebrew scriptures. The temple flames visible from miles away, the gold melting and running between the stones, the population killed or enslaved, the city razed, over 1 million dead by Josephus's count. Daniel said, "The sanctuary will be destroyed after the Mashiach is cut off." This is not poetry, this is not allegory, this is a timeline, a specific, quantified, historically verifiable timeline, written in a text that was sitting in a jar in a cave at Qumran before Jesus was born, that says, the Messiah will come and be killed before the temple is destroyed. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD, which means, according to Daniel's own mathematical framework, the Messiah had to have come and died before 70 AD. If no Messiah came between 445 BC and 70 AD, the prophecy failed. But every major Jewish theological tradition insists that the biblical prophecies do not fail. The ancient rabbis themselves recognized the problem. The Talmud, the great compendium of Jewish legal and theological reasoning compiled between 200 and 500 AD, contains a passage in Tractate Sanhedrin that says, Rabbi Johanan said, "The world was created only for the sake of the Mashiach," and elsewhere, with painful honesty, "Woe to them that await him, and woe to them who do not await him." This is not a statement of confidence. It's a statement of tension. The rabbis who lived after the temple's destruction knew that Daniel's timeline had expired, and the reconciliation was difficult. Rabbi Hosea ben Kisma is recorded in the Talmud as saying that the Messiah would come before the second destruction of the temple. After the temple was destroyed, this tradition became increasingly difficult to maintain. Some later traditions proposed that the Messiah had been born, had actually been born, and was waiting somewhere, but had not yet revealed himself because Israel's sins were too great. Others proposed that the calculation was different, that the sevens should be interpreted differently. But the most honest engagement with Daniel's text leaves a mark that centuries of interpretation cannot quite erase. The window closed with the destruction of the temple. Now we must turn to the most painful part of this investigation, because we cannot understand the full depth of Jewish rejection without understanding what happened after the first century. What happened when the name of Jesus became attached not to a Galilean carpenter, but to an empire. And what that empire did. In 1096, the armies of the First Crusade swept through the Rhineland on their way to Jerusalem. In the cities of Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, they gave Jewish communities a choice: convert to Christianity or die. Thousands of Jews were massacred, men, women, and children, in the name of the cross, in the name of Jesus. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, the official council of the Church, decreed that Jews must wear identifying badges on their clothing and were to be excluded from public office. The theology of Jewish guilt, the idea that the Jewish people as a collective bore inherited responsibility for the death of Jesus, was codified in ecclesiastical law and used for centuries to justify discrimination, forced conversion, and violence. In Spain in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed to America, 150,000 Jews were expelled from their homes by the decree of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella at the urging of the Inquisition, with the cross as the emblem of state authority behind that decree. In Russia, Ukraine, and Poland, between the 18th and 20th centuries, organized massacres of Jewish communities, called pogroms, killed tens of thousands. They often took place on Christian holy days. Churches sometimes provided the mobs with shelter and legitimacy. And then, in the 20th century, in the heart of Christian Europe, 6 million Jews were systematically murdered in what their killers called, though this was a grotesque distortion of genuine Christian theology, a project rooted in centuries of church-sponsored anti-Semitism. We are not saying that Christianity teaches this. We are not saying that the New Testament endorses this. We are saying that this is what the Jewish people experienced under the banner of Christianity for nearly 2,000 years. Imagine being asked to embrace the name of Jesus, when that name, in your people's memory, is attached to the sound of swords and the smell of fire and the image of your grandparents forced into a ghetto, forced to wear a yellow badge, forced onto cattle cars. The rejection of Jesus among the Jewish people is not, in the modern world, purely a theological question. It is also a wound, a deep, generational, historically documented wound. And any honest investigation must reckon with that wound, not to assign blame to Christians today, most of whom had no part in those atrocities and find them as horrifying as anyone, but to understand the full shape of the distance between two faiths. This is the full picture. Not simply a people who missed a prophecy, a people who experience the name of the one they are asked to believe in as a name that has been used for centuries to justify their suffering. And yet, something is moving in the world. In the last 50 years, a movement has emerged from within Jewish communities that the rabbinical establishment of the first century would not have predicted. It is called Messianic Judaism, and it is populated by people who do not believe they are abandoning their Jewishness when they accept Jesus as the Messiah. They believe the opposite. They believe they are completing it. Messianic Jews read Isaiah 53 as their heritage, not as a Christian imposition. They observe Passover and see in it the imagery of the lamb's blood on the doorpost, imagery that they connect to a death that, they argue, Isaiah anticipated. They celebrate Shabbat, they observe the high holy days, they read the Torah, and they see in Yeshua, the Hebrew name for Jesus, the name meaning salvation, the fulfillment of the very covenant that their ancestors preserved through fire and exile and unimaginable suffering. They are not a majority. They are not without controversy. Many in the mainstream Jewish world regard Messianic Judaism as a form of Christianity in disguise, a missionary project designed to undermine Jewish identity. This is a legitimate and ongoing debate within Jewish communities, and it is not our place to resolve it here. What we can note is the historical irony. The movement that is reconciling Jewish identity with the person of Jesus is not being led by European Christians arriving with a doctrinal package. It is being led by Jewish people who read Isaiah in Hebrew, who know the Talmud, who light Shabbat candles on Friday night, who look at the tradition from the inside and say, the suffering servant was always part of what we were preserving. We did not lose our heritage. We found the center of it. And this is not entirely without precedent in the first century. The New Testament records that on the day of Pentecost, 50 days after the crucifixion, approximately 3,000 Jewish people in Jerusalem accepted Jesus as the Messiah in a single day. Paul's letters indicate that the earliest church in Rome had a large Jewish contingent. The book of Acts describes thousands of Jews in Jerusalem alone, described specifically as zealous for the law, practicing Torah-observant Jewish believers who also accepted Jesus as the fulfillment of the Messianic promise. The break between Judaism and Christianity that we take for granted today was not, at the beginning, inevitable. It was forged across centuries of conflict, of persecution, of political boundaries hardening into theological ones. Whether you see the current emergence of Messianic Judaism as a fulfillment of prophecy, as a cultural synthesis, or as a complicated theological question without an easy answer, it exists. It is growing. And its existence means that the conversation between these two ancient faiths is not, after 2,000 years, finished. But as a historical and theological fact, these communities exist. They are growing. They represent, in some readings of the prophetic framework, a precise fulfillment of what Paul of Tarsus, himself a deeply trained rabbi who never considered himself to have abandoned Judaism, wrote in his letter to the Romans, chapter 11. I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. A hardening in part, not a rejection in whole, not a curse, a temporary partial hardening described as a mystery until a specific point in the divine timeline. What is striking about this passage is not just its theological content, but its author. Paul was not a Gentile writing about Jewish people from the outside. He was a Jewish man, trained by the rabbi Gamaliel, perhaps the most respected legal scholar of the first century, writing from inside his own tradition. And he is saying that the rejection was not accidental, was not the result of moral failure alone, was built into the structure of a plan that has not yet reached its final act. Whether you accept that theology or not, the structure it describes, partial, temporary, moving toward resolution, maps surprisingly well onto the actual historical trajectory. The rejection was not absolute in the first century. Thousands of Jews followed Jesus in that generation. The rejection hardened over centuries in direct proportion to the Church's persecution of Jewish communities. And now, after the Holocaust, after the establishment of the State of Israel, after decades of Catholic and Protestant churches officially repudiating the theology of collective Jewish guilt, the hardening is, in some quarters, beginning to soften. The story is not over. And perhaps that is the most important thing our investigation has revealed. We came into this with a question. How did the people who preserved the prophecies fail to recognize the one who fulfilled them? We have followed the evidence carefully. We have stood inside the rabbi's mind and felt the weight of Roman soldiers and the fire of messianic expectation. We have watched Caiaphas calculate the political arithmetic of survival. We have unrolled the great Isaiah scroll and read words that were already ancient before the first century began. We have worked through the mathematics of Daniel 9 and felt the precision of a timeline that closes with startling specificity around a narrow window of first-century history. We have encountered the two Messiahs doctrine, preserved in Jewish tradition itself, and seen how the framework accommodates both suffering and triumph, both Ben Joseph and Ben David, both a first coming and a second. And we have sat with the wounds, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the pogroms, the yellow badges, the cattle cars. We have not looked away from those wounds, because looking away would be a betrayal of the people whose story this is. Here is what we know at the end of this investigation. The rejection was not simple. It arose from sincere theological conviction, from a prophetic framework that was real and textually grounded, from legitimate political survival instinct, and from centuries of trauma accumulated under a banner that should never have been used to cause that trauma. The prophecies, preserved in texts that predate Christianity, describe both a suffering servant and a triumphant king, both a rejected one who is pierced and a reigning one whose kingdom has no end. The ancient Jewish tradition itself held space for two messiahs. The argument is not whether these two figures exist in the text. They do. The argument is whether they refer to two appearances of one person or two separate persons across time. And Daniel's mathematics leave a precise, uncomfortable footprint on history. The window for the Messiah's arrival and death was open. It is now closed. Whatever you make of that, the timeline does not disappear. And now we come back to where we began. The year is 30 AD. You are in Jerusalem again, the smell of dust and blood and incense. The Roman soldiers at the gates, the crosses on the road outside the city. In this city, on these streets, a man from Galilee with calloused hands and no palace and no army is walking toward a hill called Golgotha. He is not what they expected. He is, depending on who you ask, either the most catastrophic misunderstanding in the history of religion or the most precise fulfillment of prophecy ever recorded, visible only from the distance of 2,000 years. He walks toward the hill. The crowd watches. Some weep, some mock, some look away. The Roman soldiers do their work with the efficiency of men who have done it before. And then, depending on what you believe, either the story ends or the story begins. We leave you here, not with an argument, not with a verdict, with the image that the prophet Isaiah, writing 8 centuries before that hill existed, somehow already knew. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. The scroll ends, the cave is dark, the desert is silent, and the question hangs in the air above Jerusalem like the smoke from the temple altar, rising, 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 and going somewhere we cannot see.